Hello and welcome back. We're continuing our discussion of topic five. Today we're going to be moving into lesson two, which is looking at how Europeans began to spread into Asia. So we're going to talk about other parts of the world, but lesson two is mainly looking at Asia. Okay. The main group to actually be involved with Asia at the beginning were the Portuguese. Remember that they were the first to reach India. They, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, had Africa and Asia as their territory. So they were the first to really begin to expand into that area. The first place they really encountered, of course, were the Indians. They came in while the Mughal Empire was in power. And for a long time, they were able to coexist with the Mughals, although they were sort of bullies. They did establish settlements, outposts. Goa was the first one that they did set up in India, and they did sort of bully the Indians. So when we say coexist, the Portuguese couldn't really take over India, but the Mughals couldn't really get rid of them either. So that was the situation there. They also spread into Southeast Asia. They took Malacca, which is at the end of the Malay Peninsula, which was a major, the Malacca Straits is a major trade connection in Southeast Asia towards the Spice Islands. So they were able to establish an outpost there, but ultimately they were thrown out by the Europeans, particularly the Dutch. Speaking of the Dutch, they had a company, a corporation that they created called the Dutch East India Company that was a very, very powerful organization. It basically was a government in and of itself. The Dutch government decided since this was going to be on the other side of the planet, there was no quick way of communicating. They gave this company rights to print money, to pass laws, to execute sentences. They can make treaties, extremely powerful. And so they controlled basically what's now Indonesia for quite some time. By the middle of the 1600s, they'd already set up, trade with China and had pretty much gained a monopoly of the spice trade. They tended to get along better with the Asians. They weren't quite as aggressive as some other groups, but they still, gained control forcefully over these areas. The Spanish also are involved in Asia by the in the first half of the 1500s because they want to establish trade with China. Also, they have access now to silver in the Americas, and so they want to have a base of operations to trade with China, and so they take over the Philippines. And one consequence of this, of course, is that Filipino culture is heavily influenced by Spanish. Spanish is a common language there. Many Filipinos are Roman Catholic. So there's a connection that's been a long time in the Philippines as a result of this. How did Asians respond to the Europeans being there? Well, in India, you had an empire, okay, that was one of these gunpowder empires that could resist, but over time, they were kind of worn down because technologically they were not able to keep up with the British and the French. And so over time, the British and the French basically are fighting over India, and the Indians have no choice but to kind of sit back and watch. In China, you had some fairly powerful dynasties still. So at this stage in the game, um, you know, China basically is telling Europeans what they can do and what they will accept. One examples of this is when the McCartney mission from Britain went to China. They weren't met with a lot of respect because basically the Chinese said, "You need our stuff a lot more than we need yours." So they basically dictated the terms to the British. Now, over time, as the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty begins to weaken, Europeans do take over and dominate China. But we're going to talk about that in later topics. With Korea, they're kind of wedged between China and Japan. We talked about them earlier. They chose to isolate themselves. They decided that the best thing to do is to just not get involved with all of this. And Japan had sort of a unique perspective too. Japan initially welcomed Europeans, particularly the Portuguese. They were very fascinated by European culture. They were fascinated by Christianity, by the technology that people had in Europe. And so initially, there's kind of a blending of some cultures there in Japan. But the Portuguese and the Spanish got involved with local politics, and this, of course, is in the time period when the Tokugawa shogunate is gaining power in Japan, is solidifying their control, and so they decided foreigners were not welcome in Japan. So, starting in the 1600s, they began to expel people that were European. They began to order people to abandon Christianity, and they made it so that Japan was totally isolated and remained that way until the 1850s when the Americans, made the Japanese open up. But from the 1630s until the 1850s, only one Portuguese or one Dutch ship rather was allowed to dock in Nagasaki every 2 years. And they were basically confined to a certain area. The Japanese people were not supposed to have any contact with them. So lots of different ways that Europeans and Asians were interacting with one another. It ranged from outright conquest to basically asserting their own sovereign authority over themselves. So that's it for lesson two. If there's any questions, as always, get in touch with me, and I will see you back for lesson three. Thank you.